Awesome. All right, so my talk today is titled Modeling to Enable Personalized and Preventative Digital Medicine in the Wild. Thank you for that kind introduction. I've really enjoyed my time at Stanford so far. It's really nice to be in California and not in Vermont in February. So as Jen mentioned, I direct the MSense Research Group, University of Vermont. We're a translational digital health group. So the goal of every project that we start is ultimately to translate our findings from the lab out into the market where they can make a difference for patients. The mission of our group is to empower patients with digital health technologies. So we do work in an area called digital medicine. Who's heard of digital medicine before? A couple people, almost everybody. Awesome. Okay, so the idea of digital medicine is to use these devices that we're carrying around with us every day, things like our cell phones, our wearables, to provide objective measurements about our health, so-called digital biomarkers. We can then combine those digital biomarkers using concepts like machine learning into digital phenotypes of a disease, risk for experiencing some type of symptom, or some sort of health outcome. And these digital phenotypes in and of themselves are super helpful. You can use them as novel endpoints in clinical trials. You can use them for clinical assessment, but also the idea of digital medicine is that you can develop so-called digital therapeutics that take those digital phenotypes as inputs, make treatment decisions and deploy interventions directly to the user via those same devices they're wearing on their body or carrying around with them every day. And so the hope with digital medicine is that you can have this sort of closed loop opportunity via these technologies to make people healthier. So when I think about this in the context of neurorehab, I think that this model applies pretty well. You could do some sort of assessment to characterize the function of a person or their risk of experiencing some sort of outcome. You could do personalization, and we'll talk a little bit more about how you might be able to do that. Deliver this intervention, assess again to see what the outcome of that intervention is, sort of operate in this closed loop fashion. At first, this necessarily has to happen with healthcare providers in the loop, and likely it may stay that way. But I think there's an opportunity also to potentially have this closed loop thing that's supporting healthcare providers in their practice, ultimately allowing us to develop personalized, preventative, and in the wild interventions. So the next piece of my talk is focused on highlighting a study that we're doing in our lab about where we're sort of trying to do this. It's called just-in-time fall prevention. And this project is aimed at addressing the more than 1 million people in the US who have multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a degenerative neurological disorder. It has symptoms that cause you to be at increased risk for experiencing a fall. About 50% of people with MS fall in any 3-month period. And we know that the symptoms in MS fluctuate considerably from one day to the next, or even from 1 hour to the next within a day. But unfortunately, the assessment procedure for characterizing fall risk in this population only happens once every 6 months. And so it doesn't really match these fluctuations in symptoms that we know these patients have. And fall interventions are largely reactive. So a patient may come to their neurologist appointment, they'll tell them that they fell, and then they'll be prescribed an intervention to reduce their fall risk. But they're really not preventative. And so there's this need for new assessments and new interventions that can help prevent falls in this population. This is true, I think, of anybody that has balance and mobility deficits. We need these same sort of preventative interventions. And so this project is work that's done by 2 of our graduate students, Brett Meyer and Lindsay Tulipani. It's funded by NIH and Metadata. And it's the idea here is to take wearable sensor data and continuously monitor somebody's fall risk using statistical learning. And you have these sort of fall risk models. When fall risk is detected to be high, you deploy an intervention that suggests people change the way that they're behaving during their everyday lives to reduce their fall risk. And the system is deploying things that are sort of well known to physical therapists, transitioning out of a chair in a particular way, walking with your feet a certain distance apart, things that these patients have likely already learned, but the system is designed to provide them sort of just-in-time reminders to help them engage in those practices at home to reduce their risk of falling. Okay, so where do we use modeling in this process? And the first is in this assessment phase. So developing fit-for-purpose digital phenotypes for fall risk. And this is a challenging problem. I think we all know that fall risk is a multifactorial problem. We're capturing just one aspect of it. But to start to dig into this a little bit, we've created a platform that we call our Digital Phenotype Discovery Platform. And the idea with this platform is to continuously capture information using wearable sensors about how people are engaging in their everyday lives. We use activity recognition, so statistical modeling, to detect when people are doing things like walking, when they're standing, when they're transitioning from sitting to standing, balance challenging activities. We then have a set of algorithms that allow us to process data from those activities and characterize how people are engaging in them. We then do data aggregation and exploration and visualization of the platform. So the next couple slides characterize or sort of share some of what we've learned by deploying this platform in our patient populations. And I'd love to discuss it with you all afterwards, because I think we're just getting sort of started on this problem. There's lots more to learn. So the first thing that you may think to do as you're trying to develop a phenotype for fall risk is just to throw machine learning at it, right? And that's what we did too. So we took data from an in-lab gait assessment. People were walking for 60 seconds. We trained a deep learning model that took 4 strides of data as input, just accelerometer data from your chest and your thigh. We leveraged a bi-LSTM architecture because through a systematic review of the literature, we found that deep learning algorithms that sort of embed some domain knowledge often perform the best for these type of tasks. In the case of fall risk and MS, we know that things like gait variability are predictive of if you'll experience a fall. And so this bi-LSTM architecture allows us to capture those temporal relationships that are important for variability. When you look at the performance of a model that's trained in this way, you can see that it's about on par with models that are trained on patient-reported measures and a neurologist-administered exam in this sample. So the performance is pretty good, and you can even improve that a little bit by looking at a full 1 minute worth of data as opposed to just 4 strides worth of data. Okay, so I think it's really interesting to think about how you may process data that's collected in the clinic in this way. But we've also looked at data collected more in the wild, sort of outside of those clinical doors. And what we find is that in-person active and passive measures provide some sort of complementary information. So if you're looking at trying to characterize the difference between fallers and non-fallers, this is chair stand test data and data from daily life to stand transitions. You can see that the daily life measures perform better at discriminating between these two groups. But if you're trying, there we go. If you're trying to discriminate between groups of folks that have sensory and non-sensory impairment, a supervised 30-second chair stand test does better than those other two contexts. And similarly, if you're trying to characterize between groups that have pyramidal and non-pyramidal impairment, you see it's also those supervised 30-second chair stand tests, and to a certain extent, the unsupervised 30-second chair stand tests that do well. So I think what this really means is that a lot of times when you talk about people who do wearable sensors work or who are capturing information about patients in the wild, they say, oh, the in the wild is better. But I think really it's not. It's sort of capturing a different construct. And likely if we're thinking about comprehensive assessment of fall risk, we should be considering all of these measures together to provide sort of a complementary piece or set of information that can ultimately help us reduce fall risk and prevent falls. But what we do see is that some remote measures may actually provide stronger relationships. So this is data from a postural sway assessment in a clinic. This is jerk is your postural sway measure here. These are subject-specific distributions computed from a standing balance assessment that our patients engaged in. Each line is a patient. And we see that there's a moderate relationship between jerk and balance confidence amongst these patients. But when we look at data that's collected from the home environment, the strength of that relationship is much stronger. This is a magnitude of the correlation between activity-specific balance confidence and a variety of postural sway measures collected over a number of days. We'll talk more about this in a slide. But you see that you have correlations around 0.7 from this at-home data and correlations around 0.49 from data that's collected in the clinic. And likely we think what's happening here is that, at least in the context of fall risk, it seems like the parameters that matter are things that are sort of at the edges of your distribution. So not sort of how your balance is normally, but how your balance is when it's really bad or really good. And so by capturing data at home, you get many more observations of postural sway, and so you can better resolve the edges of those distributions. But a natural question when collecting data at home is, okay, so how much data do you actually need? There's a significant burden to patients to strapping these devices on. If you're using adhesive sensors, there's a significant cost associated with the adhesives that patients have to wear. There's skin irritation that happens. There's all kinds of reasons not to put devices on people at home. And then you also need to know how much data to collect to get reliable estimates of these biomarkers. And so we started to explore this a little bit. And we found that at least in our population, you're able to get reliable estimates of some gait measures after only a day of data collection at home. You can get reliable estimates of some postural sway parameters after 2 days. And that's what's shown in this heat map here. These are correlations of the function of number of days that a subject wore a sensor. If you do a regression analysis on this, longer wear durations are predicted by increased variability and decreased observation rate. So what that means is that if you have a parameter that's more variable, you need to record data for longer to get a reliable estimate. Similarly, if you're observing it less often, you need to record for longer to get a reliable estimate. So I think it's important to consider this when we think about how do we actually leverage these technologies to engage or capture this information from patients in the wild. Okay, so that's some of what we've learned about remote patient monitoring in this population. We were asked explicitly to talk about computational modeling in this conference, and so my next couple slides are also about computational modeling, but they tackle this same problem of how do we reduce patient burden so that we can actually deploy sensors to patients in the wild. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a hybrid modeling approach that we've developed that allows us to estimate knee moment biomarkers. So in estimating knee moments with wearable sensors, there's some really good work in the literature doing this. But unfortunately, the number of wearable sensors that are required are pretty high, right? So these are two of the best papers that we found. One requires 17 IMUs deployed to 17 body segments. One requires 7 IMUs deployed to 7 body segments. And so fundamentally, people just won't do this. They won't wear 7 IMUs or 17 IMUs and go home and engage in their everyday lives. And so we needed a new way to do that. There's been a nice advent of multimodal wearable technologies. This is some work that was done by Reed Gerchek, who was a PhD student in my group and is now a postdoc at Stanford with Jen and Scott. And he developed this wearables-only approach for estimating knee joint moments using EMG-driven analysis. And so traditionally, if you were to leverage an EMG-driven modeling approach to estimate knee joint moments, you may have to put something like 10 EMG sensors on somebody's leg. And so that's what this would look like. That would be 10 EMG sensors. And what Reed did, which I thought was really ingenious, was develop an approach for reconstructing unmeasured SEMG signals. So if you were to take 3 EMG measurements, you can use a machine learning approach to reconstruct the other 7 that you might need, and then drive your neuromusculoskeletal model using those reconstructed EMG measurements. And it turns out this process works pretty well. You can estimate things like knee moment, which was our goal. The plot on the top here shows peak knee extension moment as estimated from inverse dynamics, or as measured from inverse dynamics and as estimated by our process. But what's nice about this modeling approach is that you also get access to all kinds of other dynamically consistent potential biomarkers to consider. Things like muscle forces, muscle work and power, joint reaction forces. That can really help in trying to discover new biomarkers and ultimately define new digital phenotypes. Okay, so what are the key opportunities for computational modeling? To me, I think within the context of digital medicine for neuro rehab, I think it really is around creating digital twins that allow us to do intervention, selection, and tuning. Because ultimately, without this personalization, we aren't able to develop those digital medicine approaches that actually help to make people healthier. And in a nod to my sabbatical sponsors, I think there's some really cool examples of this in the literature, although it's just beginning to sort of be released. This is a great paper from Scott Ulrich, where they use simulation-based intervention design to describe how to provide biofeedback to reduce knee contact forces. And so I think this was a great example, but really it's just the beginning. We need this sort of applied in new ways and in other areas. In terms of key challenges for computational modeling in digital neuro rehab, I think the add biomechanics tool, as Steve mentioned, is a really amazing tool, but it depends on the need for optical motion capture data, or it sounds like also we can do it with video data now, which is awesome. But I do think for us, for those of us who like to use wearable sensors, I think we need to advance these tools to allow the use of wearable sensors for sort of fitting these models to enable our neuromusculoskeletal model simulations. And similarly, I think one of the big challenges in sort of this approach to digital medicine and neuro rehab is in having an adequate representation for the base models that we use. And so making sure that we have sex and age and potentially disorder sort of adequately represented so we get good model fits and personalizations to enable then treatment decisions. Okay, so I guess to sum up briefly, it's an exciting decade for digital medicine and neuro rehab. I think we're at the cusp of making some really significant advances. And I think especially collaborations between folks who do in the wild sensor analysis and folks who do really great computational modeling is how we're going to advance this field into the future. And so I think meetings like this need to keep happening because it's A, been really exciting, and B, I think is a way that we can actually make people healthier. So hopefully that is a personalized, preventative, and in the wild approach to the future. So with that, thank you. I think I'm a little bit under time, so we may have gained some time back. I got to thank my collaborators, all of our funding sources, and then my fantastic graduate students who contributed this to work, and then my two kids who are up there who ultimately make all of this possible and way more fun. Thank you.
All right, so we've got lots of time for questions.
Yes, thank you for staying on time and all of that. You get a medal.
Thank you.
Help yourself to coffee. So I love what you're doing, and so just to essentially get your opinion on the elephant in the room. So all this technology is going to happen. It's going to be clinically useful. It's going to be portable and wireless. But then we're in the wonderful world of remote therapeutic monitoring. So those of us with startups, those of us with SBIR funding, those of us rolling out products to help people in the real world, in the wild, right? So what is your view of, I mean, right now is the Wild West.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we're going to meet the reality of, is this reimbursable?
Yeah.
Is this affordable, et cetera? So what is your thinking on how are we going to get this out to the real world? So this is a shout out also to the SBIR program, both at the NSF and the NIH. So
I love the shout out to the SBIR program. Yeah, so I think it is really critical to have the funding sources that let you do this translational work, which is a shout out to the SBIR and SDTR programs. I think it's critical that we do the validation and sort of evaluation of these technologies in a really detailed way that allows you to characterize their clinical impact, and that you have the funding to do that. But
you're up against VC, you're up
yeah,
against manufacturing. So I mean,
which you can join me up here if you want to, Princess.
I mean, I worry that a lot of this is, aspirational at best. It could be wishful thinking because there's so many technologies that don't make it. I mean, the market sizes are small by VC standards. Then there are some very interesting models of going to crowdsourcing or nonprofit, et cetera. So even if we had the data to demonstrate that, any suggestions on how to get this to market?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer for you realistically. I think that, to your point, potentially a model from sort of the do-it-yourself prosthetic field could be interesting to explore, right? Like there's these opportunities for people to print prosthetic devices for folks who may need them in your community. I think the First Hand is an example of one of those. And there may be a similar model that's available here where you have sort of makers who can create these technologies for use by patients who are in the wild. But yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer. I think it'd be something good to explore together.
Can I comment on that actually? Hey,
yeah, go for it.
I mean, I think this is also one place where the movement towards more open data is going to be really critical, because at the end of the day, the common factor is people, right? And so whatever technology we're using to measure people, the physiology should stay the same. And like sensors are easy, sensors are cheap, right? Like these technologies will become, and they'll just get cheaper and cheaper, right? The amount of sensors in our smartphones and video technology. And so I think what's really problematic is when the field accidentally gets like vendor locked, right? Like when the analysis you're doing is coupled to like proprietary models and you can't get out of that walled garden, right? And this is the problem in healthcare. Like everything's locked into EMRs, that's a whole thing, but like it really holds back progress. And I think we'd do this community a disservice if we let that happen with these kind of technologies.
I was wondering about potential like patient adoption of this type of thing, like when COVID notifications became a thing, like my instinct was just like erase, ignore, for like stop pinging me, this annoys me. So like what is your feedback? Like how do you view patients adopting these things and listening to feedback from their phone about how to change their gait or something in a particular moment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a couple ways to sort of address that concern. I think one, with the COVID pandemic, I saw this report, I think it came out yesterday, where it's like 80% of people now have experienced digital healthcare, like largely, I think, through telehealth, but it's also not person-to-person telehealth. It's like phone calls, asynchronous messaging. So I think the patients are much more receptive to this idea now than they have been in the past. But I think really it comes down to sort of user-centered design and building systems that take that patient perspective and physician perspective into account and creating them so that you're building things that are meeting people where they are and sort of allowing them to engage and get better together.
Other questions? There we go.
Just a quick question. So at Penn, there's a group called the Nudge Group, and they use they're arguable these types of sensors and thinking about adding reward structure to them so that when you send out a nudge, which I think, to kind of like, hey, change this, that there is a response and an actual change. So my question is, when you do send out those nudges, are people actually responding to them, and can you detect the difference in the data that you pick, that actually how many people are complying and how many people are not complying? Because that might be interesting in terms of if you could detect that in the data set.
Yes, it's a really good question. We're not there yet with the just-in-time fall work that we're doing. We're sort of at that stage of just trying to characterize fall risk and examine if you can provide prompts where people actually change what they do. But we're exploring that in other studies. I put up this slide here. This is a large study we're running now in 600 UVM freshmen. It's longitudinal for the next 5 years to understand how do you actually nudge people to perform healthy behaviors and focusing on a transition period in people's lives where they're going from living with their parents to living alone, their brain's developing, all kinds of things are happening that we need to try to help encourage the development of healthy behaviors when they can really sort of catch hold. But a big piece of that is trying to understand better how do you actually provide nudges or prompts to people and get them to engage. And all of them have aura rings, so we are able to characterize sort of what their response is, at least at a behavioral level. It's a really good question. Thank you. I think it's a big piece of the success of these types of interventions. Oh, thank you.
Certainly measurement can help to describe people's behavior, people's, conditions, things like that. And the development of the sensors, that's wonderful. But my question is about the field, like to what extent in the field it is known that which specific parameters would be mostly informative and which are not informative. That kind of understanding is already accumulated in the field. I'm just curious.
In terms of the field of fall risk monitoring in particular, or just generally in sort of this digital biomarker phenotype field? Sorry.
The general.
Oh, the general.
We're asking you about all the challenges with digital.
Everything. Okay, cool. All right. I'm up to the task. I don't think we know really realistically what is important yet. I think what we're finding is that data that's collected in the wild, like really out of the clinic in everyday life, is so noisy that it's not clear that the things that were important in the clinic are the same as what's important in the free living environment in the wild. It's not clear necessarily how to ignore the noise and find the signal. But I think those are sort of technical challenges that we're sort of diving into now. And I think structured frameworks like this one help, because it allows you to focus on at least those activities that happen during the day where you can characterize sort of accurately what's happening. And we have a hypothesis a priori going in that those may be indicative of somebody's fall risk in this case. So I think a model like this could be useful, but then the question is really like, how do you detect those activities that are meaningful? Because it's easy to do human activity recognition, but there may be, I had a great conversation with Jeremy Brown earlier about this. There likely are more nuanced activities that we want to capture that we don't have good models for yet. But I think it's, there's potentially a way to take the model or the approaches that we've used for human activity recognition, maybe apply them to other more challenging things to sort of detect during everyday life. Hope that answers your question. But yeah, I think the real answer is I don't know. Nobody does.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. So I'm wondering about the time scale. Maybe you mentioned this and I missed this, but how far in advance that those area under the curves for early 88%, and then how surprising are these to people versus what they can, I guess, intuitively probably, we have some sense of becoming unstable or I don't know, weak or dizzy, whatever the reason is, but how much additional information does it give beyond what probably people could tell themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think you're referring to this slide in particular. So these are based on sort of fall risk groups. So we recruited a group of people who had fallen previously and a group of people who hadn't, so high risk and low risk. We're still working on trying to do this. This is the study that we tried to run over COVID that made recruitment challenging, but that we're still trying to do that predictive modeling. So can you detect and how long before can you detect when a fall will actually occur? It's a really good question. And I think because we don't know, I can't answer your second question.